This paper follows on very directly from Pat Smith's analysis of the drawings by Delaroche after Dumas' Henri Trois-Sacours. With the aid of a couple of other recently discovered visual documents, I want to go further in suggesting a line of descent that involves a broader conspectus of visual culture and is anchored in the historical experience of the 1820s. At the same time, this analysis will revolve around the same painting, the assassination of the Duc de Guise, the first version of which was completed in the same year as Jean Gigoux completed this striking unpublished drawing of the rising young at intermission. Here is the finished painting of 1834, commissioned by the Duc d'Orléans and shown at the Salon of 1835. The Magasin Pittoresque devoted its front page to a woodcut, which of course emphasizes the unusual format of the work, with the empty space at the center being underlined by the white surface of the page. In its commentary, much was made of the crowds that gathered around it, although it was hung very close to the floor and tended to be obscured by the women's feathered and flowery hats. In fact, certain thefts were committed in the vicinity of it. There's long been a consensus that Delaroche's pupil, Gérôme, had this work in mind when he exhibited his Duel after the Masquerade at the Salon of 1857, the year after his master's death. In this replica version, it traveled across the ocean to the Walser's collection in Baltimore and helped to establish his fame in the United States. It's possible that Gérôme had in mind quite another painting recounting an episode after a mass ball, Charles Marchal's, from the 1855 Salon. But recent studies, such as that of Guru Kashnak, have suggested the close link to Delaroche. Now, I want to do, in this particular paper, what I want to do is to suggest that there are paintings actually that predate the Duc de Guise, which trace the line even further back. Pierre Vingeron's Les Suites d'un Duel from the Salon of 1822 and Delaroche's Lost Duel scene shown at the Salon of 1827-28. And these both occur in Ackermann's catalogue as a suggestion of where the Masquerade dates back to. Now, in fact, the catalogue of Ackermann gets the titles and the names muddled. Pierre Vacheron's Duel was shown in 1822, and it was Delaroche who gave the title Les Suites d'un Duel to his subsequent work. Now, Vigneron is an artist who's only surfaced quite recently in a remarkable exhibition devoted to the Salon of 1819 at the Musée Giraudet at Montargis. In the year 1819, as you see, he exhibited Le Convoi d'un Pauvre, a stark scene of poverty, which stood out very much at the time. But more relevant for our purposes is the fact that he was actually the first to mark through lithography the tragic assassination of the Duc de Berry, heir to the French throne, in February 1820. Within days, Vigneron had published his first print, you see on the left, and shortly afterwards, the scene of the deed at the Paris Opera. And it was followed up with further images as the Duke lingered, as he did for quite a time, on his deathbed. It was this lithograph that led me to the first link in my genealogy. When I discovered this lithograph of 1829, a proof made in London with no indication of authorship, but entitled simply a Duel, I thought it might possibly have been a version of Delaroche's Lost Duel scene from the 1827-28 Salon. In fact, it turned out to be a lithograph after the Vigneron Duel, which was shown at 1822, and popularized also in the form of an engraving by Jazet. Now, I don't think I have to underline the fascinating similarities with the compositions of the Duc de Guise and the Duel after Masquerade, common to all being the contrast between the dead and the dying victim and the perpetrator whose back is turned away from us. But what I want to emphasize particularly in relation to Vigneron is the fact that this is no fanciful scene, but actually the index of an appalling social problem. In the wake of the political shift to the right that followed Berry's assassination, duels to the death were rising in number, and this particular point was noted by Charles Landon in his reference to Vigneron's exhibit at the 1822 Salon. I want to insist here on the difficult social and political context of the 1820s in France, since it attempts to explain the ways in which the representation of the history of 16th century France becomes a channel for the expression of deep feelings that could not be otherwise, could not in other ways evade the regime of censorship. Vigneron's 1822 Duel was celebrated enough in its print form to achieve actually a parodic form in Charlet's 1825 lithographic album. Here you see the pose of the duelist indicates not that he's near death, but is in a drunken stupor brought about by the excesses celebrating the reconciliation with his opponent. But in the same year, Horace Vernet completed a series of lithographs for a sumptuous new edition of Voltaire's Henriade, which endowed the historical reference with a very contemporary plangency. The Henriade was Voltaire's mock heroic account of the tortuous fortunes of the Valois dynasty in the 16th century, not forgetting, of course, the assassination of the Duc de Guise, and culminated in the accession of a new king, Henri IV, whose mission was one of reconciliation. It has, of course, been accompanied by illustrations in the 18th century, and here you see a famous series after designs by Maurice Lejeune, which was reprinted after the fall of the Empire, and includes a death scene, which could well have been a model for Vigneron's recumbent figure in the duel. Maurice Lejeune was indeed Horace Vernet's grandfather, and his series of large lithographic prints culminating in the new Henriade, published in 1825, was an exceptionally ambitious one. Beraldi, later in the century, described it as being a little too much in the troubadour mode, sort of rather fanciful historical recreation, and there's no doubt at all that his rendering of this recognition of Dailly is rather quaint and stagey. But the same cannot be said about the two vigorous and emotionally effective prints representing the duel between Turenne and Aumale, the death stroke here being delivered, and the second showing the corpse with blood-stained tunic being conveyed by a troop of soldiers. It's perhaps worth signaling here that Aumale, let's say the Aumale of the Henriade, was a member of the Lorraine family, a relative of the Duc de Guise, and indeed the future Louis Philippe gave the title of Duc d'Aumale to his fifth son, born in 1822, who became the eventual proprietor of the assassination of the Duc de Guise by Delaroche. Well, then it was in 1825-26 that Delaroche painted his Lost after the duel, and I fear it still remains lost. But the closest we can get to it is probably the lithograph by Vernet's pupil Eugène Lamy after a painting by Delaroche, which has been invested with Scottish local colour, including the spire of St Giles's Church, to illustrate a French translation of Walter Scott's The Abbot. But we can at least see the skirmish between the groups of retainers taking place as a result of a prior fatality. You see that in the form of the stretched out corpse in the foreground. In the absence of After the Duel by Delaroche, the key picture by Delaroche which springs to mind at the point of this point in time in the middle of the 1820s is his Commun de la Force, painted in 1826 and exhibited at the 1827 Salon, and only known nowadays, I think, through the photograph by Robert Jefferson Bingham. It is, however, worth mentioning at this point that the loss of this work and its successor, the death of President Duranty, shown at the same salon, have obscured the fact that the succession of works related to the French Renaissance history and the Henriade is no less prominent, or was no less prominent, in his production of the 1820s than the sequence of works after English common themes that happen to have survived. And of course, it's this line that leads directly to the choice of the Duc de Guise as a subject. The story of Commun de la Force is indeed included in the Henriade. The future comrade-in-arms of Henri IV was supposedly extricated from under the corpses of his Huguenot father and brother after the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. And uniquely for this period of Delaroche's career, there are two drawings which indicate that he made studies from the figure, from the life, to work out the position of the bodies. And this will be an important point in the conclusion to my argument. If the lithographs for the Henriade seem to be a crucial reference for Delaroche from the first half of the 1820s, that role is surely taken over in the second half by a very different kind of publication, the reading plays of Ludovic Vite. In fact, 1827 is the date of the second episodes of this series. There I'm actually showing a later edition, but it is 1827. It's called L'État de Blois, and you can see the Cross of Lorraine on the title page, which came directly into conflict with contemporary censorship. This play, as you can see here, was studied closely by Delaroche. It's clear from the fact that he made a remarkable contemporary composite drawing in the Louvre collection, made, I calculate, I think by 1827, and consisting of small compositions that directly evoke the scenes described by Vite. But Delaroche's sequence stops short of sketching the actual murder of the Duke. You can see there is a kind of box which is vacant, but you can see just before the timorous entry of this king into the scene with his question as to whether the dreaded act has been carried out. I should point out here, of course, that the Henriade had been illustrated before. The very first illustration shows the assassination of the Duc de Guise, coming from the 1728 edition. But what Vite provided, if no visual commentary, was at least this extremely elaborate plan of the Chateau de Guise, the Chateau de Blois, with, as you can see on the right, and under the letter D, the king's bedchamber, which is shown there to be a long chamber with a shrine in it on the far wall, and on the right, the king's bed, and the entry for the king on the left. This, I could think, would be directly the result of the format chosen by Delaroche by his painting. Now let's look just again at the lithograph, and I've turned it round because it's very likely that the painting was actually this orientation, and it leads us very directly into the first study for the assassination of the Duc de Guise from 1830. What follows is a smaller but much more detailed 1832 watercolor painting, which was bought by Count Demidoff and is now in the Wallace collection. And a crucial detail, it appears to me, is the blood staining the doublet of the victim and seeping onto the floor. The ascent of the Orleans family to the throne in 1830 had, of course, entirely eradicated the stigma which was attached to the Cross of Lorraine and its subversive connotations in the previous decade. The young Duc d'Orléans had every reason to commission this the enlarged oil based on this composition, but these significant markers of the death wound are not maintained by that point. The drawings by Delaroche from around 1833, which represent different components of the scene, were presumably done in the process of scaling the figures up from a small watercolor to the final oil painting, and did not include any such blemishes. You see one of them from the V&A collection. This was a period, incidentally, when Delaroche's drawing skills were at their height, and included, for example, this spectacular study for the wall painting of the Madeleine, which has recently been the highest priced at auction work by Delaroche ever to be sold. That's among his drawings. So where does this leave my final exhibit? A drawing for the Duc de Guise, which is undated and only recently discovered. Not to go too far into the provenance, I should say that its English provenance goes very far back. And indeed, there's the penciled name of Sir T. Lawrence to be found on the back. Lawrence died in January 1830. The style of the drawing is indeed quite unlike that of the preceding studies for the 1834 painting, one of which I've just shown. And the only comparable drawings in style are those made for the 1826 painting of Caumont, as I suggested in the studies from this. And as I suggested In studies from the life, this drawing details the droplets of blood on the doublet, and the victim's head in particular recalls the upturned face of Como's brother. Without hazarding any further guesses apropos of this extraordinary drawing, I should say that it suggests at the very least the hypothesis that Delaroche's Duc de Guise was conceived before the July Revolution. The genealogy that leads us to Gérôme, also takes us back into the crucible of Restoration history and into the period's uniquely lively visual culture.